Milne, everyone.
Well, thank you very much, and congratulations everybody for turning out today, because it is people power that we have to rely on to stop this extradition of Julian Assange and force the Australian government to act. As I speak for justice today, I too want to acknowledge that we are meeting on Aboriginal land, the land of the Mohanina people, and I want to pay my respects to their elders, past, present and emerging, and acknowledge also that the struggle for justice for our First Peoples is by no means over. I'm here today speaking in support of Julian Assange because every single one of us, every single Australian citizen has a role to play in standing up for and protecting human rights. It's basically fundamental to a civilised world. I'm also here because as global citizens, we have a right to know what is being done in our name. The media throughout the world must be free to publish and broadcast the facts, no matter how unpalatable they are to governments. And I'm also here because I happen to think Australian citizenship actually means something. It means something. We are Australian citizens, we pledge loyalty to our country, and in return, we are entitled to the protection of the state. And it isn't happening for Julian Assange. Now, it's not very many years ago when I was in the Senate during the Iraq War that the Australian government allowed the US to abuse David Hicks. And it was only people power in Australia bringing pressure to bear on the Howard government that finally saw David Hicks come home and be allowed to serve the rest of his sentence here. But in the course of that, it was shown that the US engaged in kangaroo courts, that he was charged with offences that weren't even the law at the time that he was charged. And what we know from the David Hicks experience is it's going to be doubly worse for Julian Assange, and we are seeing it now with the US, with their superseding indictments, where every time they want to, they just put a new document on the table, not new facts, not new information, just another indictment which spreads the responsibility to try to develop a net that will somehow catch him. The thing we also have to remember about David Hicks is that when he did come home, the Howard government saw to it, in my view, that there was a 1-year media ban on David Hicks speaking out, and that was leading into the 2007 election. The Howard government said, it was the US that imposed that. Well, all you can say about that is that where the US-Australia alliance is concerned, political interference is right there just below the surface. And so too to Julian in terms of what has happened to David Hicks. He is subject to dubious legal tactics, as I just mentioned. He's in prison. His health physically is deteriorating, and mentally he is subject to torture. It is simply untenable that Australian citizens can stand back and allow that to happen to another Australian citizen. And why is it happening? Well, as our previous speakers have pointed out, as a publisher, he infuriated and exposed Washington by showing the world US war crimes in Iraq and Afghanistan. And as a result, as Greg Barnes just said, the US has flexed its global muscles, demanding that Julian Assange be punished as an example to every other journalist and publisher worldwide, as if the reach of the United States justice system is global. Now, the Australian government and the Labor opposition have fallen into line, currying favour with the Trump administration. And if that is not a fact, why is it that the Foreign Minister can fly all over the world seeking to secure freedom for other citizens, but not Assange? And as Peter just said, if they're prepared to do that to Assange, they're prepared to do that to any one of us. And if it was your son or brother or sister or whoever who offends the Americans anywhere, you could well be next, as indeed we noted in that famous memorial about the Second World War You know, if we don't stand by him as they come after him, who will stand by us when they come after us? And that is where we are now on Julian Assange. And I too want to congratulate Peter Whish-Wilson and Nick McKim and Andrew Wilkie and all of those on the parliamentary group who've got together to actually take this up to the government. And I have to say that instead of standing up for Assange, you've got Maurice Payne and Linda Reynolds flying to the US to reassure the Trump administration that Australia remains at its beck and call. And frankly, I find that embarrassing. It is humiliating to be such a global doormat of the US. What we are seeing with the government is complicity. They are complicit in a number of nations ganging up on an individual citizen for the benefit of the US. And that is you, Scott Morrison, that is you, our Prime Minister. You are complicit with a gang of other nations destroying the human rights of one of our own citizens. Shame. Shame. It's time for the Australian government to bring him home. Extradition to the US, we know, they know, is a death sentence, and we cannot allow that to happen. The heat needs to be turned up on the Australian government, and the first thing they need to tell us is when they knew that the United States was spying on Assange in the Ecuadorian embassy. When did the Australian government know that, and why didn't they do anything about it? There's a Spanish court case on right now into that security firm as to who was actually employing them to spy on Assange, and this is not to provide security to the Ecuadorians, this is to spy for the Americans. It does not pass the pub test in Australia that the Australian government was not told by the US that they were spying on Assange. Let's actually start turning up the heat on the government. You can't just let them hide behind, oh, we are providing consular advice. I am sick of hearing about providing consular advice. Let's start providing some serious political clout here. Let's start standing up for Australian citizens in the global arena, because we, the people, have not abandoned human rights. We haven't abandoned freedom of speech. We haven't abandoned the need for the media to actually provide evidence in a digital age. They're fundamental principles that we're going to stand up for. We don't like secret trials like the Bernard Collaery Witness K trial. We don't approve of that. We don't want this slide into authoritarianism. We support human rights of all people, for Aboriginal children, for refugees, for people like Julian Assange. And we are going to stand up for the Australia that we aspire to, and that is a genuine democratic country with an independent foreign policy, respected in the world, and not a US doormat. Bring Julian home.
Wow. Thank you, Peter and Christine. I've got a lot of great new material for my next political letters. Thank you very much. I'll be on the computer tonight. Now, please welcome former war correspondent and bureau chief in Baghdad during the US-led Iraq War, Dean Yates. Thank you so much, Dean.
Thank you. It's a tough act to follow, Christine. To my Aboriginal and Torres Strait Islander brothers and sisters, I am sorry. I am sorry for 230 years of white oppression. I am sorry for 430 black deaths in custody since the 1991 Royal Commission. I am sorry. My name is Dean Yates. I was a journalist for the Reuters news service, the world's largest news provider, for 26 years. I was the bureau chief for Reuters in Iraq in 2007 and 2008 when the Collateral murder tape came out. That was when an Apache gunship opened fire on men in a street in Baghdad in 2007. Two of those men were my staff. I'm sure a lot of you are familiar with that footage, and that's why I'm here to speak today about that tape and about Julian. But first of all, I just want to say that up until a few months ago, I really hadn't thought much about Julian. I was living in my own sort of personal world. Who wants to listen to an old guy with PTSD anyway? Rabbit on. But then Peter Wish-Wilson, a friend of mine, came and spoke to me, and he said, you know this Collateral murder tape better than just about anyone alive, so why don't you speak out a bit? And it took me 5 seconds to think about it, and I thought, yep, you're right, Pete, I need to speak about this tape, because what is happening to Julian and the potential for his extradition to the United States could set a very dangerous precedent for accountability and transparency around the world. I think what's happened with Julian's case is, for a lot of people, it's become too complicated to understand. It's become a case where a lot of people have forgotten really what it's all about. This is what it boils down to. It boils down to the public's right to know what those in power don't want you to know. And in this case, did the global community have the right to know how the US military waged war in a foreign land? Collateral murder, that videotape provides that answer. It shows more vividly than anything else how the United States waged war. And that is why every Australian, including Prime Minister Scott Morrison and Foreign Minister Marise Payne, needs to watch that tape. Okay, it is graphic, it is distressing. Minimise it on the computer screen. Turn down the volume if you have to. Even just read the transcript. But every Australian needs to watch that tape if they want to truly understand what Julian's case is all about. Prime Minister Morrison, Foreign Minister Marise Payne, I implore you to watch that tape. That tape shows you what the war in Iraq was really like. It came from the air, and it came with commentary. It shows a man wounded on the ground in the streets of Baghdad trying to get up for 3 minutes. It shows pilots. It shows them bantering about him. Come on, buddy, all you got to do is pick up a weapon. It shows them waiting to get permission to open fire on him. And when that permission is given, they open fire with 120 rounds of 30mm cannon from an Apache gunship, obliterating that man who was my staff member, Sayed Chum, father of 4. They obliterate the driver of a minivan who had pulled up to help him and wound his 2 children who are inside that van. It's a potential war crime. That's what Collateral murder showed. That's why every Australian needs to watch that tape, because that's what Julian's case is all about, exposing what those in power don't want you to see. And in fact, the US military, I believe, was so embarrassed about that tape that they refused to give us that tape, despite us trying to get it for nearly 3 years through our lawyers in the United States. It was only when Chelsea Manning got the tape and leaked it to WikiLeaks that tape was put into the public domain. And that was thanks to Julian Assange. And for those people who say that Julian is not a journalist, well, Julian sent people to Baghdad to verify that tape. He sent 2 people to Baghdad, including Kristen Hutchinson, the current editor-in-chief of WikiLeaks, to Baghdad to track down the 2 children who were wounded in that minivan. And they found those 2 people. So I think that sounds like the work of a journalist. I think people are getting too hung up about whether Julian is a journalist or not. I think we can have this argument and debate until the sun goes down. The question here is about the rights of whistleblowers to give information to publishers, and the rights of those people to publish that information and not have to worry about the state coming after them. That's what this case is about. And we've only got to look at, someone else mentioned before that Julian was awarded a Walkley in 2011. So I guess the last point I want to make is, why are Australian journalists not speaking up for Julian? I don't understand that. I really don't. And not just Australian journalists, but the global media. Where's the New York Times? Where's the Guardian? If you are a media organisation and if you have been using WikiLeaks material for the last 10 years, you better start speaking up for Julian, because he has been your source, and your source is now sitting in a hellhole in Belmarsh prison. Start speaking up for him or stop using his material. Julian also changed the way journalism is conducted. Look at the way whistleblowers now get information to media organisations through these things called secure drop. I think you can probably trace that to the way WikiLeaks was set up, allowing people to send information to media organisations. And look, I know how the media organisations work. I worked at one for 26 years. I know young journalists can't just get out there on Twitter and start expressing their views. They'll have HR coming after them. What I would suggest people need to do is walk into their editors' offices and say, why aren't we speaking up about Julian? This is not about journalism versus activism. This is about your profession. And Julian represents a principle here that you need to protect, because if you don't protect it now, when the time comes, then you are going to regret this moment, because I think this is a very, very pivotal moment, and the time to act is now. We only have to look at what's happened with Dan Oakes from the ABC to see the writing on the wall here in Australia. So I would really urge my journalist colleagues in Australia to start speaking up for Julian. He was your source, and your source is now in jail. Please speak up for him. Thank you.
Wow. Thank you so much, Dean Yates. Now please welcome Hobart's own federal MP and whistleblower, Andrew Wilkie.
Belmarsh Prison is a menacing place. It's in the outer eastern suburbs of London, large concrete bricks. It's where the British jail the worst of the worst. It's full of hardened criminals, murderers, terrorists. It's also the home for more than a year of an Australian journalist who has not been convicted of any offence, hasn't even been charged by the British government or the Australian government for any offence. He's been detained there among the murderers, the terrorists and the others simply because the British are concerned he's a flight risk. What patent nonsense. In fact, when I was at Belmarsh Prison in February with my parliamentary colleague, George Christensen, of all people, there was a murder in the prison that afternoon. And what is the Australian government doing about this outrageous injustice? Nothing. Zip. Zero. Nothing. In fact, in the last week, we had the sight of a conga line of Australian cabinet ministers flying off to Washington to meet with Mike Pompeo, of all people, the former head of the CIA, who described WikiLeaks as dangerous as a foreign intelligence organisation and an enemy of the United States. I bet our cabinet ministers didn't say squeak about the fate of Julian Assange when they had that opportunity. And that says everything about what the Australian government really cares about, that it will put the interests of another nation ahead of the interests of an Australian citizen. Yeah, shame. I reckon shame. And you know, our Prime Minister makes much of the fact that he has a good personal relationship with the US President and the British Prime Minister. Well, it's a relationship that's been cultivated at public expense only because he's the Prime Minister of this country. So why doesn't he use that relationship and pick up the phone and do something about this shocking injustice? Because I have no doubt that if Scott Morrison was to pick up the phone to Boris Johnson, or if Linda Reynolds or Maurice Payne were to pick up the phone to their new best buddy, Mike Pompeo, I have no doubt that that conversation would see Julian Assange released from Belmarsh, the extradition dropped, and that man allowed to return to Australia as he should be. Let's not forget the substantive matter here. Julian Assange, a journalist and a publisher, shone a light on and revealed hard evidence of US war crimes. That's all he did. He revealed hard evidence of US war crimes. We've spoken about collateral murder. I bet you've all seen it. I bet none of you will ever forget it. The sight of that Apache attack helicopter gunning down unarmed, peaceful people, including journalists in the street. I know who should be in jail. It should be the crew of that helicopter, not the journalists that reported it. And what's the US up to? They want to get even. Mike Pompeo in particular wants to get even. I suspect Donald Trump had never even heard of WikiLeaks and Julian Assange until Mike Pompeo got in his ear and said, let's get even. That little mongrel and his organisation embarrassed us, and we're the United States, and we're not going to stand for that, and we're going to get even. We're going to charge him with countless espionage charges, one charge of conspiracy to hack, and we're going to get him back to a dodgy federal judge in the United States, and we're going to lock him up for the rest of his life, and he's going to rot and die in a US federal prison. And then we'll feel good about that, because then we've got even. How on earth can the Australian government think it's okay for a person to be sent to the very country that was found of the war crimes he reported on? The injustice in this is breathtaking. And the precedent it is setting for all of us is chilling in the extreme. Chilling that the Australian government will put another country's interests ahead of an Australian citizen. Chilling in the extreme that the Australian government thinks it's okay to lock up for life journalists who just do their job, who go out and find information and publish it in the public interest. Chilling in the extreme that the Australian government respects the claim to extraterritoriality by the US government. Remember, Julian Assange is an Australian citizen. He did not commit any offence on US soil. The extradition agreement between the UK and the US specifically excludes political crimes like espionage. How dare the US think that it's okay to claim extraterritoriality, that it now has jurisdiction over every citizen of the world in any country of the world? Yes, shame. Does that mean the next time an Australian journalist writes something that offends the government of Saudi Arabia, or offends the regime in Beijing, or offends some other government somewhere in the world, and that offended government says to the Australian government, we want to get our hands on that journalist because we want to get even? Well, a precedent will have been set, and we will have no way of knowing that in future the Australian government won't roll over again and let any country have any one of our citizens, because we've signed up, in fact, we've more than signed up, we're genuflecting to the regime in Washington and saying we respect that you have a right to do whatever you want to anyone, anywhere in the world, for any reason. That is so wrong. I'm delighted that Peter's here. I'm delighted that Nick McKim, Adam Bent from the Greens and other people have joined the parliamentary group for bringing Julian Assange home. There are independent members. There are Centre Alliance members. There are Green members. There are Labor members. There's even a National Party member, Barnaby Joyce. There's even the Liberal National Party member, George Christensen. There's not a single Liberal Party member. And it's about time parties like the Labor Party started listening to its backbench and started giving voice to the Labor backbench and started to stand up for Julian Assange, stand up for the rights of Australians, stand up for justice, stand up for international law. Quite frankly, the bottom line is the extradition must be dropped and Julian Assange must be returned to Australia, and he must return a hero, not a villain.